All right, everybody. Thanks everybody for joining. I think we're going to kick it off. We may give it just one more moment. I think we have still a number of people attending and joining. I see our numbers going up, which is great. While everybody's doing that, just want a reminder: we do have a live chat that we'll use for questions at the end. So you can enter your questions in the chat, and we'll try to address all of them. We'll go over that in a moment. And again, we'll just give it another minute or two. I still think we have people attending or joining in here, so we'll give it another minute. Okay, I think we're 1 minute past, so we'll start the webinar. Thanks everybody for joining. Looks like we're gonna have great attendance for this, so appreciate everybody's interest in the topic. So we'll be talking about today building an AI automation strategy, specifically focused for teams that are going to be transitioning or looking to transition from predominantly a manual testing strategy, quality assurance strategy. So we got a lot of good content to go through. So with that said, we'll get it kicked off and talk about our agenda first, and then we'll do some introductions. So for our agenda today, again, I mentioned we'll do some introductions. Both myself, my name is Chris Faraglia, and Bruno Mazzotta from testRigor. This is a partner webinar for both testRigor and TestRail. So we'll do intros in just a moment. We'll talk about this idea, the evolving role of manual testers in really the modern dev cycle, like how things are changing, not just from a market perspective, from a technical role and actual persona user perspective. Talk about challenges faced by manual QA teams. That's another area that's evolving. And then we've seen some pretty clear market trends. We'll talk about how to manage your automation backlog and really to how to get a good grasp on what is the backlog, how can we manage it, and how can we really align this with this concept of AI-based automation, leveraging AI technology. And I know Bruno has a lot of great insights for that. Best practices and how to do it, right? Transitioning from manual to automated testing. Again, what does that look like? What are the smooth transition points and best practices to not just do it, but do it effectively? And then number six here, we'll talk about really scalable automation and manual strategy, combining these two, leveraging AI and using focus labeling for test types. And Bruno will walk us through that. And again, really double downing on this idea of AI and integration um, with how to achieve that. And then we'll do some live demo for both TestRail and testRigor around integration and execution. And then we'll have some Q&A sessions at the end where we can ask some questions and you can add some comments in the chat. We'll try to get to as many as we can. So we got a pretty action-packed agenda. Um, with that said, let me go ahead and kick it off with introductions. I know I've been talking a little bit, but I'll introduce myself first. My name is Chris Faraglia. I lead solution architecture at TestRail. I'm based here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and roughly have 15 years throughout various areas of software engineering, software quality assurance, and QA, large-scale enterprise test automation. My specialty really is around regulated and high compliance industries, mainly around healthcare and commercial nuclear power. In my free time, I like to do jujitsu and MMA, mixed martial arts. So always a area I like to train and spend some time outside of the tech space. And really just passionate about helping teams achieve quality through scale using centralized test management and integrations. And that's a great topic for a lead into what Bruno's here to talk about today. So I don't know, Bruno, if you want to give a quick intro.
Yeah, sure thing. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, yeah, sound great.
Beautiful. All right, awesome. Yeah, so my name is Bruno Mazzotta. I am coming to you right outside of Boston, in a little town called Dedham. I've been in the automation space for actually, I need to update that to be 7 years, 7 plus years. I am a animal lover. have a cat, and when I'm not trying to, help people streamline their automation, I do woodworking. I make my own beef jerky. I play soccer. A whole bunch of things. But very excited for today's session.
Awesome. Yeah, happy to partner with Bruno and the testRigor team. And just to mention again, this is really part of our partnership between TestRail and testRigor. And you'll also see some of the built integration that testRigor's done to TestRail. So really happy and excited to talk about this today. So let's kind of get going, really dive in talking about this idea of the evolving role of manual testing and really the modern dev cycle. And what are we really seeing with this? So kind of bring some insights to kind of like what trends are we seeing, right? Um, we talk about this idea of manual testing, right? And again, from the TestRail perspective, that's a large part of what TestRail does. In addition to integrations and reporting and analytics, is obviously manual testing. And really, manual testing at a very high level started with really just focusing on executing predefined test cases, right? These are more test quality practices that originated in more rigid waterfall or like phase gate model type development structure, where we're just executing predefined steps. We're basically just trying to find bugs through human interaction or manual stepwise interaction. And usually these were not even integrated into teams, right? Like they would have a separate team that would do more static QA after development was done, after a certain gate where the code was already completed. And we were very rigid. Now we kind of follow more of a model where we're now even involved earlier in kind of shift left, right? The modern manual tester, even if they're not writing technical automation, is involved in test planning and strategy. We're highly collaborative across development and product managers, and we see this a lot when I integrate with organizations and teams in the TestRail side, that they're getting involved very early, and we're really engaged early on in the cycle rather than following more traditional phase gate or waterfall model. And then really focusing on, double downing on experience or really deep domain knowledge. A lot of our manual test roles now you'll find are industry experts, domain experts in a given role or roles around that space. So that's one of the areas we see definitely evolving in manual testing and a manual tester focused kind of persona. So how does the SDLC actually change? We talked about what the role of a manual tester looks like, and it's definitely transitioning and going more technical and more specialized and focusing on different things and how we operate. How is the actual evolution of the actual development lifecycle of like producing software? Like how has that changed and what does that migration look like? Well, I mentioned earlier on about waterfall and this idea that we have really defined phase gate processes of, doing design, doing some type of development or coding, then doing testing after the coding is completed, having some criteria for testing to pass and then deploying it, right? So we're very rigid, we're very waterfall, and it really is not iterative at all, right? We have no feedback loop or feedback process. So that's the first one, and that's really where this early idea of the manual tester began. The second one here, we talk more traditional agile scrum, where we have more cycles where doing more design, code test in certain cycles. Maybe it's almost quarterly releases, or maybe it's every 6 months, or on some type of cycle where we're delivering value more often and less rigid, and we're basically having miniature iterations of what we saw in waterfall, but maybe every 2 weeks, 3 weeks. Um, those that follow scaled agile framework, it could be within a given PI. We're doing this 8 to 12 week cycle. And then lastly, where I think that we're moving to now and the evolution and really moving through is starting to look at, AI and continuous delivery, right? So maybe we're doing these iterations and delivering at the end of a sprint every 2 weeks. So we kind of follow this continuous delivery model, and that's something that's been pretty prolific across teams. But one of the newest things really is this idea now of AI enhanced agile and continuous delivery. And there's different definitions, but basically leveraging AI tooling, not just for development, not just for testing or DevOps, but really across the stack to rapidly increase the speed that we can produce high quality code, that we can integrate, and then now even test it. And Bruno will talk about that with testRigor's really great offering on AI driven, generative AI based technology for testing and how we integrate with TestRail. So we'll see the evolution of the SDLC changing, and this is really driving us to do different things for trends on the manual side. So from a manual test perspective, we'll talk some trends here. Some of the metrics that I'm going to present come from TestRail software testing and quality report. We pull a couple thousand of our user base, and if you're curious about industry trends, it's actually free to download. So you can go to our TestRail blog or just the third edition software testing quality report. There's a link that we can publish, but it's available for any of the metrics that I'm going to show, and basically looks like various areas of software testing, quality assurance, and they're all user sourced insights and really expert analysis around us. So that's where these are going to be coming from. So what are some interesting trends that we're looking at when we talk about the industry? One of which specifically is focused around what are areas that teams really do manually versus what types of tests are teams now doing with automation. And I think this is a really interesting kind of parallel because if you look here, functional testing, regression testing, unit testing, that's some of the top areas for automation. And obviously, we're not doing manual unit testing. But if you notice here, the same types of tests that teams are really doing manually are very similar: regression, functional testing, end to end testing, smoke testing. So, what that tells me is that we're seeing a definite shift of what was initially be doing as a manual process, we're now transitioning over and really focusing and working that backlog down to getting these things automated to increase that release agility and really speed that we saw in the SDLC trends. So it's no secret that teams are automating more and more of what they've done manually and refocusing these manual efforts in other areas. So what are these trends plus some outcomes? Like, what does that really mean? One area we talk around industry trends are like the development cycles are getting faster. They're accelerating. We already talked about the idea of AI being integrated into an agile and accelerated release cycle. Automation is going to continue to increase, and the demands for automation in all different areas are continually going up. And this idea of AI assisted development is going to even increase the pace and complexity, really, of software development and the testing that we're going to have to do. So these are all really known trends. The outcome of this really is that automated testing really now has to move from something that's nice to have or would be good to have to really a necessity for us to keep up with the level of automation, deployment velocity, and frequency that teams are going to want to achieve. And also integrating other technologies for within teams and processes, right? It could be, Teams or Microsoft Slack based integration for notification of failures or integrating with other third party tools like Jira or Confluence or other integrations. And they're going to want to do this at a more rapid pace, regardless of what it is. And then the testing speed, efficiency, and scalability is going to be more of a near term focus to just prepare us for what's ahead. It's not going to get slower, it's actually going to accelerate even faster. So we need to really focus on doing that and look at the tooling, the process, and really everything we need to do around manual testing to kind of get us over the line. So let's dive in and talk about some real challenges, right? We already know what the trends are and really the direction with a lot of the teams that we've seen and teams that, both Bruno and I talk to are going. What are some of the challenges just so we can really have a good base of what are we facing and what do we need to overcome? So here's some top challenge areas that, like, I know Bruno sees a lot on the test rigor side, and I'll just talk about a couple of these and I'll let him go ahead and elaborate more when he does his demo in some areas that testRigor I definitely know addresses. But flaky tests, skill gaps, right? Some teams are less technical. Maybe they're not a bunch of Java developers to write Selenium WebDriver UI automation. Technical blockers. I think these are all great ones that kind of Bruno's provided. Missing bugs and basically running tests that take too long. I mean, we can go through a lot of these. Coverage is not enough. Just having automation not be reliable, and it's very similar to what we see in the TestRail side for those that integrate with us, that automation can be really hard if we don't have the technical depth and basis and the tools and the right strategy to do it. So these are really big challenge areas, specifically around automation tooling. And this is really areas that align with what we have in our testing and quality report from TestRail, right? frequent test breakage. Test data management is really a big one, right? I mean, it's hard to manage data and align it and have a great strategy. Lack of skilled personnel. I mean, if you're predominantly have a career and you've been more manual testing and not as much of technical development, there's definitely a gap on what tools and what you can use to achieve the goals that you want. Um, Around tool selection as well. And then it plays into flaky or unreliable tests, right? If we're not picking the right tools, we're really going to have trouble to try to achieve the results that we want and get good performance and adequate coverage. And then the last theory is here really slow execution or making it hard to integrate in CI/CD. All these things need to be built and orchestrated and really have a skill set around DevOps integration that teams may not have or may not have the resources to do. So these are all just compounding challenges that we know that our teams face that we work with all the time. One of the other areas that I mentioned is release velocity, right? So this is kind of a buildup of, we know the kind of direction that the industry's going, and we talked about that. The need to do automation and why manual and transitioning our manual test focus in various areas is important. Not abandoning it, but refocusing it. And this is a key area that we see too is release velocity. Um, our software testing and quality report from TestRail says most teams now, the vast majority polled, almost 30% are releasing software now bi-weekly. And manual testing is a high level thing, really just is a statement here, is kind of a high level metric. Can't really keep up with releasing enterprise level software, which most of these teams do, every 2 weeks, usually at the end of a sprint cycle. So that's one area that I think that we should really think about whenever we're transitioning from a manual to automated strategy is how is this really going to drive our release velocity and where are we at now? So once we talk about, the idea of what are some industry trends? Where was the SDLC going? And we know it's faster, quicker, AI driven, having release velocity and matching the speed of development. You'll hear me say in some other content that we put out, we're basically developing at the speed of testing. How can we now start to manage that? So I want to talk about one last section before I hand it over to Bruno is how can we really define and manage this automation backlog? Like how can we go from manual testing and start bridging a gap into automation? And what are some tools that we can do to actually use that? So the first thing here, and really we'll talk about two key areas, then I'll show you some examples, is referencing or utilizing centralized test management, which is a good practice to put your manual tests in regardless and manage that, in addition to all automation and anything you're running from a test perspective. But once we do that, we need to have a mechanism to now prioritize what are these manual tests that we are going to use and leave as manual, and what are those that we are going to prioritize and now start to look at candidates to be automated as a long-term strategy. And these are really important things to look at when we talk about coverage and really identifying gaps for what targeted automation we're going to do. Core workflows that we want to increase and speed up versus things that we know we're not going to automate. We need to start tracking and putting prioritization to those. And TestRail has some really nice ways to do that. I have an example here, and I'll show you when I do a live portion of how we can manage both whether a test case is a candidate for automation, it may or may not be. What is the priority if that is to automate it? And then once it's automated, we can track it at the test case level so we know not to run it manually anymore, and we can have good traceability for what was run previously. So this idea of having a repository for our manual tests and a strategy combined for automation is really critical. And then once we start doing this, and we talk about tooling, testRigor, and the integration that Bruno is going to show and talk about, is a great way to do it. Right? We can iterate and evaluate as we run these tests. What test priority can we refine? Is it really a candidate for automation, or do we only going to run it a few times? What are our defect trends and changing business needs? If we're deprecating something, do we still need to automate this? Can we just manually run it and now maybe deprecate or archive the test? How are we tracking and managing these as automated tests? And then the last thing here is evaluating effectiveness. Are we automating or having good effectiveness for the test cases that we're going to automate or run manual? And we need to really constantly iterate and reevaluate these metrics for the test cases that we have. And that's really key here to adding value for our software quality strategy overall. So before I go in and give this turn this over to Bruno, I just want to kind of preface this and talking about best practices, going from manual to automated testing, and that's really kind of the next phase. So I don't know, Bruno, if you want to take it over and kind of kick us off here. When we talk about transitioning from manual to really an automated strategy. I know TestRigor has a lot to provide there in that area. If you want to talk about these.
Yeah, so I did just put together some bullet points here, just at a nice high level, and you could see that some of these are actually duplicates of things that Chris already mentioned. Um, but really, you need to think of the bigger picture in terms of ROI. Most test automation tools offer good plans for enterprises, but do consider your budget. So that's a big thing because something might be pretty expensive now, but it's going to save you money in the long run. So that's a big one. You definitely need to choose a tool that works for your entire team, not just you. So, a tool that is going to basically let everybody involved be able to, assist. Building your test environments. It's good practice to test new features across different environments. So that's something that I see every once in a while. People will only test in one environment, but not the other. So, obviously it's best to do all of the environments that's really, going to be on the focus. Check for test data provisions. So if you need a lot of data, make sure that you have a way of generating that data. And TestRigor actually has some built-in functionalities to do just that. Tools compatibility with the rest of the technology stack. So you know that's a big thing is integrations. Make sure that whatever you're looking to use will integrate with things that you're already using. Somebody said my voice is breaking up. Is anybody else seeing that same, or is my audio coming through okay?
I think
Chris?
we hear you pretty. I think we hear you pretty good, Bruno. So maybe
Okay,
somebody else's
awesome.
connection.
Okay, cool. Carrie, thank you. I see Carrie. That's a familiar face and name. Awesome. So integrate early and often. So once again, don't get in the weeds without checking your integrations and making sure that it is working the way that you intended to. Maintain good test management practices. That's just that's something that we should all be doing all the time. You always have to address flakiness. I realize that's actually at the bottom of my list here, but that kind of leads into our next conversation here. And then also evaluate and iterate. So regularly evaluate the impact of your automated tests. So that's a big one. Also, there's no such thing as 100% automation. A lot of people say that that's where they want to be, but that's that's really not something that's going to happen because there's always going to be those manual needs. And then the biggest thing, and this is coming from somebody that's teaching somebody a new tool, you have to be patient through the learning curve. Everybody thinks that you could just absorb everything that first time you see an application. That's not really the case. So you do have to give yourself and your team a little bit of leeway when it comes to learning a new tool because it might not come as easily to everybody. But once again, focusing on some of the key things like looking through documentation and checking other test cases and really absorbing everything you can over time is huge. um, cool. And then this is one of my favorite slides because everybody who's here is probably very familiar with what a Selenium script looks like, and that's what that left side is. However, we're pretty sure, well, we're all pretty certain that as soon as something changes in your Selenium script, or really any coded language or framework, is the rework. And that rework is going to require a highly skilled person to do it. So, a developer to rewrite that code. But with TestRigor on that right-hand side, you can see we're basically performing the same thing with 2 lines of code versus what's being done on that left-hand side. So inside of TestRigor, we have a built-in function called login. That login will go through multiple variations of a login flow, whether it's click login, enter, enter username, enter password, click login. If it's enter username, click next, enter password, then click login. So there's a variety of ways that we would get through that. But once again, it's all embedded within the back end. All you're seeing as the user is login and then check page contains whatever it is you're looking for. So very, very easy to see that side-by-side comparison and how much easier it would be not just to create, but also maintain. And that's one of the big, big added values of testRigor is that maintenance. All right, so building a scalable automation strategy. So when we're looking at that strategy, obviously, we want to push the concept of, why are people moving away from code? Why are people moving towards something like testRigor? And this list right here is obviously a big portion of it. So no coding required. We already talked about that a little bit. Um, you know, so once again, if you do love coding, there's little portions where you can, but for the most part, no coding is required here. As mentioned with that login, we have a bunch of built-in reusable rules that are ready to go. So log in, log out, log in with email OTP, so there's really cool functionalities in there. But then we also give you the ability to create your own fully customizable, reusable rule as well. Think of it as a completely customizable function that you don't need to code. I talked about test maintenance earlier, but once again, very limited test maintenance. Everything's going to be plain English. So if something changes and you're referring to it in a reusable rule, you just need to change it in that reusable rule, and everywhere else will be updated automatically. testRigor does support a variety of technologies, and you could see web, mobile, native apps, and recent addition is mainframe testing. So, whatever you have out there, most likely we can cover it. We also do support cross-browser testing. So whether you're just looking to test across variety of browsers or variety of devices, we have that functionality built in, and we also have integrations with some various device farms that are out there. Chris did mention earlier the CI/CD and how that needs to be utilized. And once again, we do have pre-populated scripts for both Bash and PowerShell for that CI/CD support. We have integrations with a variety of other tools, TestRail obviously being one of them, Jira, Azure DevOps, and a handful of others. And then in addition to that, there's 5 different ways of creating test cases inside of testRigor. So it's not like we're forcing you down this one path. We're giving you a variety of paths. So first one, obviously we've been pushing this quite a bit, is the writing of the test cases in just a free-flowing English. We then also have, that little video is showing it, a Chrome extension where you can, basically record an action or a list of actions and store that into testRigor and run it that way. Generative AI. So you could give testRigor a description of something that you're looking to test, and we will generate test cases for you. Live mode is one of my favorites. That's like a built-in debugger, but it's also a live recorder. So if you open up that live mode instance, you click around, we will capture those actions, store that as a test case, and then save it for you to rerun later. And then obviously the big one here is importing test cases from TestRail. So that's going to be one that we go into next. So as you can see, that little button right there is a screen grab from inside of testRigor. So if you've already done the integration, this button would be active. And then from there, you simply do a click, and then you have the ability to, to import all of your test cases or do a search for something, and I'll show that in a little bit. But what we see, and this is from polling a lot of our customers and a lot of our prospects and just people out in the space, typically when you get to around 300 test cases, that's when test maintenance becomes more of a hassle. That's really that ceiling. What we're really trying to push with the concept of testRigor is that ceiling basically disappears. So because once again, maintaining code and script, it takes a lot of effort and oftentimes very, very skilled people. With testRigor, that ceiling once again kind of disappears because everything's going to be on plain English, and there's really no need to pull in a developer to update your code or anything like that. So, Chris, next slide here. Because the last thing you want to do is release a bug into production, because then you get a blue screen and maybe you bring down the entire airline system. You know, things like that happen when people don't do all of the testing that's required. So obviously we don't want a blue screen. But as mentioned on that next slide here, Chris, this diagonal line is really what you're going to end up seeing with the use of testRigor. Is once again, maintenance is so much easier, test creation is so much easier, because once again, we're not relying on code and script and relying on developers to you know, help with everything. So giving manual testers or business analysts, or really anybody of any skill set, the ability to go into testRigor, create test cases, and go nuts. Obviously, the importing from TestRail is going to be a huge part of this as well, which once again we'll get into in a little bit.
Awesome. Yeah, great overview and great points too to kind of double down, not just in the integration, but to kind of bring full circle. We talk about some of the industry trends and the things that we are seeing. So I think what we'll do now is transition to some of our live demo portion. So I'll kind of kick it off and really in TestRail, because that's really where it's going to actually start, right? So give me one moment. Let me just switch my screen. So whenever we're looking and we kind of talk about this concept of integration, going from manual testing, creating a strategy, doing the integration, and then really the part where TestRigor kind of picks up in this AI and generative automation, it really starts on this backlog identification. So if you remember in my earlier slides, I talked about this idea of having prioritization, tracking and managing manual tests. Because ideally, whether you're manually writing it down, it's in a spreadsheet, or you even have to create it manually first, it has to really originate somewhere to get a good structure, to do some automation, if you want to transition it to, something good and sustainable and high quality, right? In one of the areas that we do that from a TestRail perspective, so this is TestRail's test case library, which, full featured, supports any type of test case that you want to add. Um, what we can do in here, and I'm just using like a simple example in our library about this example, it's like a login button, resetting the validation or the controls on a login form. And what you'll notice is what we can do when we actually leverage this is we have these custom fields that I mentioned earlier. So if I go and edit, you'll notice here that I have a field that I've added around automation candidate. So that's the idea of this manual test that we've created. It has a couple steps, maybe some preconditions that we can add, whether this is going to be a real candidate to then be automated. And in this case, I'm selecting yes. That's something that, seems like a UI front-end automation path, and that's something that we probably could think about removing from a manual task. The other thing we have here is this idea of automation priority. So we're now combining whether we have a candidate to automate, what is the priority of automating that? And it looks like something that would be done on a login form is a, simple example here would be something probably as a high priority to be automated. Something that we would do repetitively is like an access control or kind of the front door to a system. So we've selected high here. Now, we can go and save this test case as is, and you'll notice that we have these values saved. And what this allows us to do now is we can start doing filtering within TestRail, for example, of automation priority, like show me anything that is a candidate for automation that has a high priority, right? So here's our test case, and we're actively now maintaining our backlog of test automation against our manual test set. And then this can dynamically change, be tracked and leveraged. And then eventually, whenever we go and edit this, if we come along and actually do automation, we can now identify and say, well, has this been automated? Yes, it has. We're using TestRigor's integration and we've simplified how we're automating. Now we don't want to run this manually anymore. So I can now save this, and you'll notice when I come back to our test case repository, if I go and filter additionally, right, I can now say, well, maybe I want to modify whether this is an automated test or not. So if I said this has been automated or not automated, maybe I want to see only the tests that we've already automated. You can see this is gone, right? So we've now automated this. So this is not something that I would want to run manually. So we can do filtering and actively manage and dynamically track our backlog of automation inside a TestRail as a real repository, and now align this with the integration to testRigor in an automated strategy in addition to manual. So this is really powerful. This is really best practice. A lot of our TestRail users do. So I wanted to show that before we hand it over to Bruno. So I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to hand it over to Bruno to talk more about how TestRigor is actually doing integration and some other great capabilities.
Okay, sorry. I was just trying to make sure my screen is. We'll share the screen. Pull you guys over here. Okay. All right. And once again, everybody can see my screen? Chris? Yeah. Okay, cool. Thank you. All right. So when it comes to TestRigor, what we're looking at here is all of our test cases. And these ones that we have up on the screen happen to get pulled over from TestRail already. And what we could see is that there's a couple of different linking options down here, but I guess the first thing first is the actual test case itself. So in here, what you're seeing is, once again, plain English. And you're seeing a couple of different colors in here. The red that we're seeing is a built-in, one of those built-in reusable rules that I mentioned. So we're performing a login function. And once again, that login function could vary. The next three lines are being pulled directly from TestRail. And in that case, TestRigor isn't specifically aware of what these things mean. But with the import functionality, that's going to give us the ability to pull in the test cases, and with it, leverage AI to basically determine what's needed here. So first thing is just showing you up here at the top, you can see import test case from TestRail. And if I want to import all my test cases, I just leave it as is. If I want to do a search for a specific test case, I could come in here and do a search and go from there. I'm pretty sure the one that I just searched for is already in here, so it's not going to show up again. But once again, I could add any of these, and I could go ahead and do the import. And from there, we will pull that in and then leverage AI to convert whatever those test steps are in the test case from TestRail into test steps for TestRigor. So once again, looking at this here, create new batch message for email channel. So once again, TestRigor doesn't specifically know what that means because it's not in our syntax and it's kind of outside of the typical scope. But with a couple of clicks, we can actually look at what AI did. So once again, when we pull in test cases from a test management system, we're going to automatically create reusable rules. Those reusable rules will have this AI-based rule checkbox enabled. Once that action is done, it's upon us. And I see a lot of questions coming in about manual testers losing their jobs and things like that. No, because manual testers are always going to be needed to come in here and validate that things are being done correctly. So in a case like this, yeah, AI is being triggered here, but we need to uncheck this and look at the steps that were actually being done to make sure that AI did this correctly. So you always do have to validate AI is doing it the way that you want it to. And if it's not, then let's say, maybe it missed the click continue here. So then we would just add that click continue, and that's that. So once again, anytime we call this create new batch message for email channel, it's going to run this collection of test steps. And once again, that collection could be 3 steps, it could be 15 steps. It really does not matter to us. It's more about making it easier to maintain for you. So, so once again, just taking a look at that test case, we have a couple of other things down here. So actually, if I click directly on this TestRail link here, you can see it brings us directly to the test case, and you can see the specific test steps from that test case inside of TestRail. And then additionally, let's see here. If I go back, we have the ability to actually go to the test. So obviously the test case is running inside of testRigor, and you can see all of those test steps. But then we could also go to the test itself, and that's going to bring us to TestRail side, showing us that test, and then also showing us, the success or failures. So if there are any failures, you would see those down here. If obviously passes are in here as well, but you could then jump back over to TestRigor to see that specific test case and its execution. And obviously, if there are errors or anything like that, we would see that specifically in here. And this just gives a good general overview of kind of everything. Um, so with that, obviously, it's super easy to maintain because once again, everything is in plain English. And since we're here, and this is the first look at TestRigor for some of you all, this is really some of the power. You're providing a specific, URL or starting point, if you will. This happens to be a web test, so we load up our URL. From there, we're going in and we're entering in. So once again, this login flow consists of a handful of steps. Entering a stored value into username. So stored value is us referencing a variable, or once again, a stored value. We're putting that into our email, and then we're clicking continue. After we click continue, we then load up that next page. We take another screenshot so you see the before and after, because if there is a hiccup somewhere, we want to be able to hone in exactly where that issue occurred. So our next screenshot shows password being entered. So you can see, once again, stored value password into password, and then screenshot, and then clicking login, and then us landing on our page, doing a validation, looking for programs up there. And then obviously there's some additional steps in here where we click on dashboard, and you can actually see the red box representing any of the action steps that are being done. Any yellow boxes that you might see would be representing locational references. So, if you're telling TestRigor to click something to the right of something else, that yellow area would show something just like that. And then in this case here, once again, the red represents the actions, and any green highlights, which I don't think I have any in here, but green highlights would be validations. So at every step through this flow, if you want to do a validation that something appears on screen, or that, really anything, that could easily be done. And, once again, lots of questions are coming in about, how can you reference certain elements on screen and things like that. And honestly, the best way to answer that is documentation. We have huge amounts of documentation, and I really love showing the referencing location area, because this kind of shows you the specific attributes that we're going to use to find the given elements. And then, as mentioned earlier, locational references. If you do need to click on something that's to the left of something or to the right of something, or if you need to click the bottom left quarter of the screen, those are all things that are already embedded inside of TestRigor that you could just leverage. Let's see. So I believe that's everything I have just at the high level here, but obviously, I could talk about TestRigor by itself for, over an hour, but I know we don't really have that amount of time here. So Chris, I'm going to pass that back over to you.
Yeah, no, thanks again. And great demo, Bruno. And I think we have a lot of great questions. So thanks for the demo. And I think that really highlights the integration, how we can leverage both test management, the integration of test management to start and manage our manual test cases, and then leveraging TestRail with integrations combined with TestRigor, its AI and automation and low code capabilities, and really no code capabilities, which I think is a real strength here from the trends that we saw, right? So I think that really brings it together for a lot of the concepts we talked about. Before I switch over, I know a lot of people are having a lot of good chat in the webinar, which is great. But I will say that we'll be taking questions only from the Q&A box. So if you have any questions, I'll give you a moment before I switch over. Go ahead and add them in the Q&A. Bruno and I will take as many as we can, but we'll be taking them from the Q&A only. So with that said, I'd like to go and switch over to we'll talk a little bit about Q&A before we continue, just give me one moment. So I'm just going to take them from the slide so I can see them. So we'll just go ahead and start with Q&A, and then we'll talk about some resources for both testRigor and TestRail here at the end before we wrap. So we have about 15 minutes. We'll go through and ask and answer as many as we can. I'll start it, Bruno. I think there's one or two TestRail that I saw. And then if there's any that you want to tag, feel free to do that. So I think we have a couple here that I saw here. Give me one moment. Make sure I got mine. So I think there's one that I talked about, or that Dimitri mentioned. Said we purchased testRigor. You were told around that there was some AI specific tooling, and we're generating test steps or scenarios based on that. For example, verifying login or some of the examples that I showed. So the answer for that is yes. So TestRail does have AI capability coming. The AI capability is really to help it go from requirements to the creation of test cases in TestRail. And that workflow actually not only complements but supports exactly what Bruno mentioned, because once the test case is in TestRail as a manual test, we're not doing any automation, but that's a great segue to then transition it into testRigor with the demo and the capability that Bruno just saw. So you can leverage some of our AI for our features that we have coming, focused on creating test case templating and test case content as a manual test case, and then leverage what we're doing with testRigor and their AI, generative, and platform capabilities to then automate it. So it's actually the exact workflow we showed. So it's not replacing it; it's really complementing it. Should make it even go quicker. So good question, Dimitri. I don't know if you want to take one. We'll go back and forth, Bruno, if there's any
Yeah,
one that you flagged.
yeah, that works. Just because I was starting to type this answer and I figured it might just be easier to say it.
Sure.
So Vince asked, does testRigor integrate with MSQL? I don't know if there's a typo there if you meant MySQL, but yeah, we do integrate with MySQL. We integrate with Postgres, SQL Server, Snowflake, GridGain, and MongoDB as of right now.
Awesome. I'll take one from Carlene LaPlante. With TestRail partnering testRigor, does this mean TestRail is not investing in any of our own no-code testing solutions with our current subscription? So, TestRail itself, Carlene, and for everybody that's on, we're a test management platform. So we manage both test case management, reporting, execution, and really centralizing integrations for both external tools, defect tracking, SDLC and work management software. So we're not an automated actual platform, right? We don't create automation and we don't automate testing. We're a repository and integration source and platform for that, which really makes it a great fit for technologies and partnering like companies like testRigor. So it's not that we're not investing in it; it's that we're leveraging the platform for test management and leveraging integrations for those that do it. So.
Hmm. Yeah, and then question here from Jonathan Souza. Well, it's really not more of a question, more a comment, but testRigor seems like a UI wrapper around Cucumber. No, it's not. testRigor is its own standalone application. It's not leveraging Cucumber at all. And AI is not writing the code. It's once again leveraging plain English to basically trigger the clever coding that we have behind the scenes to do what's necessary. Um, so hopefully that helps answer that question there, Jonathan. Um, and then apologies, that was actually in the webinar chat. I just saw it come up and I was like, I have to answer that. Let's see.
I was gonna say I can take one more if you want, Bruno,
Yeah,
real quick.
go for it.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
just
while
I
he's
just
thinking.
tagged one. Hiteshi, I think basic question of do we access testRigor with testRail credentials? I'll defer maybe to Bruno to chime in here, but what I will say is access credentials and configuration for that. TestRail has a way to create an API key that you would leverage with the user email address. So you could create a service account in TestRail to use, and then which you would configure on testRigor side. So I would say API key generation is in TestRail documentation. And I don't know if you want to talk about, Bruno, just some of the configuration. I know you kind of showed a little bit, but you want to touch on where would you take that email and the API generated key for the service account for automation, if you want to talk about that.
Yes. Yeah, I'll share my screen again for a quick sec.
Excellent.
All right, so now I'm sharing this screen. Okay, so for that question earlier about the databases, this is all in the settings as well. So under our settings, there's a lot of things. And sorry, I'm going to slide these things over here so I'm not looking at myself. But not only is the database integration in here, but then also TestRail integration. So this is where you would be putting in your username, your password, API key, web address, and really all the other information necessary. So then let's see. Sorry, there were a
I have
couple
one
that I
more
saw.
question. I was going to say,
Yeah,
I'll take one more question, and if you want to grab another, you can find another. So I think a question from Juiced asks, can TestRail create test cases for a retail POS Windows system? So from a TestRail perspective, I'll kind of come back to this, that we're a test case management system and platform that leverages integrations. So whatever you're using to do that, you can create obviously manual test cases, and you can integrate TestRail with basically really any platform out there. And we have a lot of our customers that do these type of integrations. So I would say you absolutely can. We don't have embedded automation technology to do that within TestRail, but it's part of the integrations that we definitely support.
Yeah, and then there was a random question in here about whether testRigor was open source or paid. We do have both formats, but obviously the paid version is going to give you more security and more access to the support team and the resources that you really need to be very successful. Let's see. Doug also asked, how does testRigor handle flaky tests? Things like buttons not ready or lazy loaded content. So that's actually a great one. And one of my favorite things inside of testRigor, and actually I don't even need to share my screen for this, but as most applications have delay functionalities, that's just kind of a built-in thing. But with things like lazy loading, if you do need to actually scroll down in order for elements to be loaded up, that would just be part of your flow. Additionally, you could put in variable delays, which I love. Wait 5 seconds up to 10 times until page contains something. So there's definitely a variety of ways that we can get around things. But when it comes down to flaky tests, the real question is what's making it flaky to begin with, and work around that. Because honestly, like that's some of the most fun that I have is somebody telling me, hey, this test case isn't working the way that I expect it to consistently. And then I look at how they're doing it, and yeah, maybe that's just a little minor tweak, but those are definitely things that testRigor is going to be able to handle. So great question, Doug.
I think I have one from Augustine. It talks about the automation flags, and this relates to the concept of managing our automation backlog and really defining it in TestRails. I think this is where this is coming from. Can these flags be integrated with Jira? It seems useful for PMs. What about automation, test cases, and metrics and leveraging those? So I've used Jira pretty extensively. Jira definitely has custom fields. So depending on where your test cases are. So I would say the only limitation of managing it in Jira is really the source of requirements, not the tests or the validation. And a lot of times there's a many to one type of relationship. So I don't think you would get a true sense of that. It doesn't have to be TestRail at that case. I mean, maybe there's another automated test management tool or different thing you're using. I mean, TestRail, I think, obviously, does it pretty efficiently where you're doing it at a test case level, not at a feature Jira issue or requirement level. I think that adds some complexity. So I'm sure you could do it. But again, like I said, our preferred method would be using a test case management platform or a structured way to do tracking test case to test case. So
yeah, and then another question that came in, and Danny, I apologize for putting your hand down a couple of times just because I didn't want that to deter things. But can mobile tests confirm push notification is received? So yes, TestRigor does have integrations with Twilio and Telnex. So if you're looking to send a text message or call a phone number or anything like that, validate that it's being answered or that it's ringing or any of that stuff, yes, that can be done. Once again, it does require one of those integrations, but if you do have Twilio or Telnex, then yes, it's built right in. And Chris did talk about that. We have the last slide, I think, is a bunch of resources, and our documentation has so much of it. A big chunk of it is around email and SMS testing and phone call testing.
Awesome. So I think we're about 5 minutes out. So I'd say, Bruno, if we each want to take maybe one more question, and then I'll go over and we'll talk about those resources. Probably a good time to do that. So I'll take one more question from Ray. Is there any integration with Playwright? So I'll kind of just say from a TestRail perspective, right? Like obviously, Playwright kind of falls into a more heavily coded and basically a node-based coded solution. But teams that do want to do that or maybe combine that with testRigor or other tools integration, TestRail does support. So that would kind of be my answer there. And then I don't know if you want to take one more, Bruno, and then we'll go over to resources.
Yeah, I'll take one more from Ian. Ian asked if it uses AI to author, well, if he uses AI to author his test case, can he see the reasoning behind the execution? Um, so when we're leveraging AI to create a test case, it's it's not going to show you the thought process behind creating the test case, but when you execute it, it's going to show you the thought process behind performing one action over another. It's going to show you based on your description of this test case, this is the best path that you know, we should take. So it will give you a general idea. It won't give you every single line of that thought process, but it will give you a good summary of it.
So I think that was the last questions for everybody that submitted questions. Thanks for doing that. Obviously we couldn't get to everything, but feel free. We'll have contact information in the slide deck. So if you want to follow up or email Bruno or myself, or go to the respective sites for TestRail or testRigor. I know there's contact forms. Feel free to reach out. So I'm going to share my screen. I just want to talk about some resources before we wrap up. So we'll talk about some resources for both TestRail and testRigor. I'll talk about TestRail, and then Bruno, I'll let you talk about what resources the team has for your side. So yeah, for TestRail, one of the big things we do is TestRail Academy. So whether you're a current TestRail customer, whether you're trialing, or maybe you just want to see what resources, learning, documentation we have a full online academy that allows you to go through step-by-step in modules and talk about areas like automation, performance testing, TestRail Enterprise, and a lot of other features around Agile. We also have our full enterprise guides and docs. So if there's something you want to look at, feature or otherwise. And we also have everything else in our support center. So if it's not in our enterprise documentation or on the academy, we have full support center documentation that's free. You can access it on TestRail Support Center. And then lastly, we also have our YouTube channel. The TestRail YouTube channel has tutorials, integrations, and a lot of the stuff that our solution architecture team is working on around the video shorts on how to configure and run certain tools and integrations. So hopefully that's helpful. I don't know if you want to mention any of the resources for TestRigor before we wrap it up, Bruno.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously I already showed some of the documentation and what have you, but within the TestRigor UI, there's a resources tab at the top right, and it gives you a good summary of really everything. But some of the big ones, that third one, TestRigor documentation. I spend a majority of my day with the documentation tab open, if not two of them, because there's so much information. We have a bunch of tutorials, and these are done by a bunch of different partners that have been using TestRigor for many, many years. We do have a mastering TestRigor training that is also available. We do have a YouTube channel that goes through, once again, some tutorials and some integrations, and then a certification. The certification is not specifically to TestRigor, but it is for generative AI. But once again, super helpful because The more you understand generative AI, the easier it's going to be to leverage testRigor. And once again, that certification will give you something that can be stored or, sorry, saved and then posted up on LinkedIn. You know, just got my certification for Gen AI.
Awesome. So I think that pretty much concludes today. We had a lot of great questions, both in the webinar chat and in the Q&A. So just want to say thanks, everybody. Thank you to TestRigor and Bruno and the team for the collaboration. I don't know if you guys have any last closing words before we wrap it up.
I don't. I'd like to say thank you as well, Chris. This has gone very well. I love the questions. I love seeing, I see Kelly in there from Sheets. So, seeing some familiar names is always great. And seeing that they're having such great success with with both sides of the house here. So awesome stuff.
Yeah, great feedback. Thanks for all the everybody that attended. And again, feel free to submit questions or directly to both the TestRigor or the TestRail team. Again, we have links on our website and also contact information. You can also find us directly on LinkedIn. I know Bruno and I provided some of our details, so feel free to send us messages there. So thanks, everybody.